The relationship between Princess Anne and King Charles III has always been the most subtly captivating of Queen Elizabeth II's four children. Never were they the most contentious, never the most reclusive. However, there is something far deeper between them, a connection characterized by loyalty, openness, and an unspoken understanding that was established long before any of them really understood what the crown would require of them. Under the unrelenting spotlight of royal life, they grew up next to each other. They were exposed to their mother's strict discipline at a young age, as well as the tremendous, unseen pressure she put on the heir. Anne witnessed it firsthand, the anticipations, the examination, being first in line, which meant being alone. She has always been seen as the one person in the family who can speak to Charles honestly, without pretense or hesitation. The two are frequently observed conversing quietly at public events, a little aside from the others. Something uncommon in royal circles has always been present in Anne's expression toward her brother: empathy without indulgence. But that calm exterior crumbled recently. Princess Anne revealed a very intimate reality that illuminates the decades-long inner hardships King Charles has faced, in what many today consider to be one of the most illuminating moments in contemporary royal history. Not just while he was Prince of Wales, but even after he became king. Few people have hitherto dared to ask the question that her comments have raised. Is the man in the crown someone we really know? According to witnesses, the change started quietly. Anne had supported her mother through some of the most difficult periods in the history of the monarchy. She had a reputation for being calm, for stability under stress. However, something was different on this specific day. Witnesses claimed to have seen her in a quiet castle hallway, clearly frightened. She reportedly brushed away her tears quickly and covertly at one point, thinking no one was looking. But there's always someone. Within hours, rumors started to spread among palace employees. Something important had happened. Eyewitnesses claimed that right before the emotional occasion, Anne had just received a private paper. According to one assistant, she came out of a secret room, white and quiet, clutching the letter as if it were the entire weight of history. Officials from the palace acted quickly. Containment started right away. That document, whatever it contained, had altered something, and the mystery was only made more complex by the subsequent silence. The corridors were quickly guarded. Employees were subtly told to keep quiet. The cameras were moved. Access points are limited. The palace, which is frequently characterized by choreography and control, had briefly broken apart, revealing something that is rarely seen inside its walls: unfiltered susceptibility. Speculation grew very intense behind the scenes. Charles had been hiding a very personal battle for months, others said. Others said that the ramifications were much more political, and that whatever had come to light may have a profound effect on the succession itself. According to reports, senior courtiers who had experienced previous royal crises likened the mood to the days after Diana's passing. That same feeling of precarious stability. A time when the monarchy was unsure of its future and whether the public would continue to trust it. It wasn't just Anne's tears that made them uneasy. The timing was the problem. Days before a significant royal encounter, which calls for cohesion, accuracy, and confidence, the incident took place. Something much more serious than ordinary palace stress was indicated by an emotional breakdown at this time. Anne's response was not one of straightforward, sisterly concern. It had the feel of a warning, a quiet warning that something long hidden had at last pushed to the fore. She retreated entirely in the hours that followed. Her itinerary was subtly cleared of public appearances. An engagement that had been confirmed was abruptly terminated. She withdrew into private family quarters, which is practically unheard of for someone who is recognized for her unflinching loyalty. Princess Anne is naturally disciplined. Emotions are dealt with in privacy. Disruptions are effectively handled. Those closest to the crown so recognized the gravitas when she took a step back. Something fundamental had changed if Anne was shaken. The stabilizer had always been her, the silent engine of poise. When others failed, they were the ones who kept the machinery running. Even she had cracked now, though, and it became hard to disregard the question, what discovery had the strength to topple the most impregnable pillar of the monarchy? It is necessary to look back in order to comprehend Anne's collapse. Prior before the tears, prior to the document, prior to the hallways being secured, meetings had taken place, private, not on tape, cautiously layered conversations. They whispered warnings to each other. And even before Anne's public poise broke, King Charles had hidden a reality inside Buckingham Palace's walls that he believed would never come to light again. So far, there was a buzz of uneasiness in the royal hallways. At first it wasn't noisy, only a change in mood. Charles had become aloof, as advisors observed. His previously unwavering confidence was replaced with enigmatic remarks and mysterious absences from important meetings. There was a change. However, straightforward inquiries are rarely asked in the palace. They are watched, measured, put away. A silent series of decisions that would eventually shatter the royal family's emotional core were made during those shadowy weeks. Charles started to change behind closed doors, in subtle but noticeable ways. According to insiders, he was haunted, not unpredictable, not erratic, frightened. He refused to identify the load he was carrying. His once calm, authoritative meetings grew shorter, fragmented. His attention strayed. He would withdraw to private quarters for hours at a time, leaving conversations unfinished as he excused himself in the middle of a conversation. The man who had lived his life training to be a leader now appeared to be trapped in his own mind. People around him took notice. However, nobody challenged him. Anne is the only one. Ever forthright and perceptive, she saw the change right away. She did not rely on conjecture like others did. She wanted to know. She faced him head-on in a rare private conversation, asking to know what had happened to cause the gap to grow between him and the world he was supposed to rule. Charles, however, ducked. His answers were measured but meaningless, hollow assurances, calm sentences that didn't tell all. Then there was another thing. His gaze, sharp by nature, there, steadfast. They stayed clear of hers this time. That was enough for Anne. She didn't require any paperwork. She didn't require evidence. They were hiding something terrible. Additionally, she was being excluded from the circle for the first time. Queen Camilla's role, meanwhile, became more prominent. She positioned herself as the gatekeeper in a subtle but definite manner. Charles's access became more restricted. Discussions were filtered. Under the guise of safeguarding his concentration, meetings were rescheduled. It seemed attentive to outsiders. It seemed strategic to Anne. Every time she tried to contact her brother, he politely refused. Serene deflection, controlled barriers. The two women's already fragile relationship started to become even more strained. Every careful conversation was tinged with mistrust within the palace gates. Courtesy persisted. The smiles continued. However, trust started to erode. And the question became more pressing as Anne and Charles's distance from one another increased. What was the unsettling fact that was excluding even family members? The rumors had vanished from the background. They got more intense. Employees started chatting in private about a private issue that was silently developing right in the middle of the kingdom. According to some, Charles confided in a valued assistant about his feelings. Others said that sealed medical records had been transferred to restricted archives, which were only open to a select few. Conversations in the hallway always ended the same way. A sudden quiet. Voices that were lower. Looks over shoulders. Nobody wanted to be heard foretelling the impending storm that they could all sense coming. One conclusion became evident to Anne as she collected these pieces. This was not a passing bout of exhaustion, not a momentary emotional stress. Charles's withdrawal was the result of careful consideration. Purpose. In private, a choice is being made. She became more and more uneasy every day, which was exacerbated by Camilla's tightening control over access and Charles's developing emotional detachment. The palace itself seemed to have started to hold its breath, awaiting for something that is unavoidable. Then the murmurs became something concrete. A document appeared. Unexpected, not planned, not found. And it made Anne search farther than she had ever searched. A letter that no one was supposed to find was buried deep in the royal archives, among restricted correspondence and sealed documents. Charles's handwriting was on it. The royal crest is sealed on it, dated some months prior. The significance of it became evident right away, when one of Anne's most dependable assistants discovered it while doing standard archival preparations. There was no ceremony here. Administrative in nature, it wasn't. It was an admission, an expression of personal anxieties in writing, of remorse, of a backup plan that might change the basis of the monarchy if it were implemented. During routine preparations for an impending royal show, the discovery had taken place. Employees were going over ancient records for the exhibit, including old ledgers, unrecorded notes, and letters from decades ago. And something modern was concealed among them. Something intentional. Something never meant to be seen by the public. Charles's writings were not symbolic. It was intimate. And maybe earthquake. It was found nearly by chance. Among seemingly ordinary archival documents, a plain envelope with an official royal seal appeared. It had no place there. It was not registered in any of the official areas that normally secure sensitive royal letters, nor was it categorized. Rather, information had been tucked away in innocuous folders. Not ruined, incorrectly filed, buried. It seemed as if someone had wished for it to be concealed, but not removed. The aide who discovered it recognized its importance right away. The aide, who was loyal to Anne and well aware of the growing tensions in the palace, decided to be discreet rather than follow convention. Eschewing the customary bureaucratic precautions, the envelope was discreetly delivered to the Princess Royal. Anne's intuition strengthened the instant she held it. She immediately recognized the handwriting, not the formal, purposeful language of official statements, but something much more revealing, erratic, rushed, intensely intimate. Written by a man who was only thinking. The royal seal was still intact. She had not been the intended recipient of this message. Not for the council review either, not for the public record. It was more than mere curiosity that opened it. It was an infringement, as well as possible rebellion, because whatever was inside may change the monarchy's internal equilibrium. Anne opened the papers and found neither ceremonial phrase nor policy language. Vulnerability greeted her. Charles described nights when he couldn't sleep. For decades, he had been burdened by expectations of a rising dissonance. A personal reality that was becoming more and more at odds with the part he had trained for all his life. He talked about feeling imprisoned in a system that he no longer thought he could maintain. Something far more important than feeling was threaded throughout those disclosures. There were signs that a choice had already been made, a route taken without customary consultation, a strategy that would circumvent senior advisors, get around the established procedure, and absolutely fail to tell his staunchest ally, Anne. The letter was both a planned plan and a cry for help. Anne read it once, but then again, and once more. The consequences become more pressing with each reading. She had been feeling emotionally strained for weeks. It was verified now. But there was another pulse underlying the personal pain. Political repercussions. Timelines for succession were mentioned, to impromptu discussions held outside of the traditional royal channels, to people outside of the typical inner circle who are consulted. She was particularly uneasy about that detail, because Charles's emotional burden was no longer the only factor at play here. It has to do with authority. and whether the monarchy's destiny was being subtly altered without its most devoted protector being aware of it. Personal misery was no longer the issue. It was a plan. A silent, calculated move had already begun. Anne felt the full weight of the letter as she stood there clutching it. The conjecture, the avoidances, all that no longer mattered, the whispering in the corridor. She had evidence. Evidence that choices with far-reaching implications had been made behind closed doors. Choices that have the potential to upend not just internal dynamics, but also the monarchy's meticulously cultivated public image. The conclusion was painful for a lady who had dedicated her life to protecting the institution from disintegration. Now Anne was at a fork in the road. She might keep quiet to maintain harmony, maintain appearances, and avoid being implicated, or she may face her brother head-on and bring the facts out in the open. There wasn't any extended discussion. Confrontation was her choice. For ages, secrets had been absorbed by the palace walls. However, this one was too unstable to be buried. It was supposed to be a private encounter. Only a sister and a brother. No helpers. Not even advisors. Not a witness. But in a few minutes, the corridor's controlled silence broke. Voices raised rose above the locked doors. Princess Anne, who was renowned for her self-control and discipline, lost her temper for the first time in years. She insisted on answers. Regarding the letter, regarding the secret scheme, about the reason she, of all people, had been left out. Political theater was not what transpired. It was a person. Two siblings, separated by truth, molded by duty, and united by history. There was an uncommon passion in Anne's voice. She has been Charles's dependable, devoted, and practical anchor for decades. However, that basis had been rocked by the finding. She addressed him as a sister who had been hurt by exclusion rather than as a courtier. Why hadn't he consulted people who had supported him throughout his life before making such a significant move? The customary layers of royal diplomacy were broken by her statements. Not in a formal tone, no careful wording, just be honest. Charles was caught off guard because he was expecting a controlled conversation. He stumbled. His first explanations were unclear. The sentences dragged on. Despite his own hearing, the justification sounded insufficient. The monarch did not look imposing for the first time in that room. He seemed cornered, and whether or not this altercation resulted in reconciliation would depend on what he was about to confess or break. Charles was clearly unprepared for Anne's comments' impact. She accused him of more than just being secretive. She said he had betrayed her. She reminded him that their relationship had never been shallow. Decades of shared responsibility, including scandal, public scrutiny, personal grief, and political upheaval, had shaped it. When others faltered, they had stood together. She saw it as a breach in something sacred to make a decision of that size alone, and to keep it a secret. Her voice grew slowly. All of a sudden, years' worth of suppressed annoyance came to the surface, unadulterated. Princess Anne, who was normally calm, spoke with hurt conviction rather than royal detachment. Charles made an effort to reply. He talked slowly, as if he was trying to find words that had been stuck in his head for months. The crushing weight of expectation was what he articulated. The ongoing examination. The burdensome weight of being unflappable. He acknowledged that using strength had become oppressive over time. He maintained that he had not betrayed anyone by remaining silent. It had served as defense, for her, for the household, for the organization. But Anne noticed something else as he was speaking. Not only a monarch under duress, a sibling who has been cornered by his own choices. Camilla moved forward to try to diffuse the situation as it got out of hand. Her courteous, measured tone was meant to diffuse the situation. The result was the contrary. For Anne, Camilla's intervention represented isolation, which she had just denounced. Decisions are made in private. She had been denied access to these barriers. Her response was incisive. This was no courtier talk. It was a sibling dispute. Courtiers later compared the environment outside the chamber to ice that was splitting under pressure. Voices were heard, feelings clashed, confessions and accusations blended together in a manner that unnerved even royal crisis veterans. This wasn't a plan, it was a collision. The truth versus secrecy, loyalty in the face of fear. Anne didn't feel satisfied when she eventually exited the room. She sensed validation. A portion of the truth had been revealed in the letter. Only a portion, though. Charles had acknowledged that he was emotionally spent. To privately question, but his justification centered on something more profound, something he continued to conceal. Anne could feel it at once. The crisis had not been resolved by the encounter. It had started it. Silence returned in the ensuing weeks, but this time it was heavier. Until Charles finally said anything, not in the role of king, not to defend, however, in revelation. And Anne was stunned into silence by what he revealed, because private burden was no longer the issue. It was something far more important. Charles's eventual revelation was more than just a straightforward admission. A personal tragedy encased a political storm. He had been fighting wars no one was permitted to witness behind the flawless grins, the meticulously planned ceremonies, and the unwavering public persona. His condition had been steadily deteriorating. Not in a big way, not all at once, but gradually, for several months. In a voice that lacked the strong cadence of a sovereign, he acknowledged it. Slowly, the words came out, first measured, then shaking. He had kept the decay hidden, not dishonestly, fearful, apprehension that revelation will cause panic. Such conjecture would clash between the monarchy, media, and markets, that the crown's well-preserved appearance of tenacity would suddenly crumble. Vulnerability felt almost like betrayal to a guy who had been brought up to associate duty with silence. He admitted that he had decided to bear the weight by himself. He has no one to trust, not even Anne, the only person who had unwaveringly supported him for decades. Anne's previous rage turned into something darker as he spoke. Heartache. This was more than just political scheming. It was solitude. Charles started thinking back to times when openness had backfired, when small rifts in royal poise had suddenly become front-page problems. Periods when family tragedy was a worldwide spectacle, when vulnerability was analyzed, and made into a commodity. His instinct had been molded by those memories. Back off. Keep hidden. Put up with the stern exterior that a monarch is required to maintain. However, this was not just a medical admission. It was the exposed dread of a generation. He talked about regretting years of unrelentingly bearing expectations. Tremendous stress exacerbated by advisors who kept tabs on every aspect of his public appearance. Every cough was recorded. Every absence is examined. Every fatigue symptom was examined. Senior advisors, he said, had emphasized resilience above all else. Continue. Don't hesitate. Don't show signs of weakness. They cautioned that the institution could become unstable at the slightest sign of weakness, so he did what he was told until compliance could no longer be maintained. And this combination of deteriorating health, increasing stress, and the recognition that time might not be as generous as previously believed led to the choice Anne had found, the one concealed in that letter. This weight was no longer merely personal. It was a reckoning. His advisor's message had remained constant. One must keep appearances. Anyhow, a monarch must never waver in the sight of the people. Charles's private pain had become oppressive due to that ideology, which had been practiced for decades. A well-designed prison in which the only practical solution seemed to be silence. The most shocking statement of all, however, followed. Charles disclosed that he had already started a change pertaining to succession, silently, consciously, without speaking to Anne, without telling the rest of the family. It wasn't a snap decision. It was premeditated. It was the result of dread, urgency, and a growing realization that he might have to make decisions before he was ready. That fact weighed heavy on Anne's shoulders. This went beyond simple emotional disengagement. He had deliberately separated himself, bearing the weight by themselves, deciding only on structural matters, protecting everyone, and keeping them out at the same time. Something changed between them in that instant. The argument evolved into something more unpleasant than rage, kindness. The ruler who had kept Anne out was no longer the only person she saw. She saw the brother who bore the title, a guy gradually suffocated by the unseen burden of tradition. Once more, she lost her cool. Not out of rage, but out of sadness. He had suffered in silence for years, for the terror he'd never expressed, for the loneliness concealed under formality. The hierarchy was removed from the debate for the first time in their lives. Not a procedure, no royal separation, the unvarnished, unveiled, and profoundly human truth. However, another stream was flowing beneath the surface as Anne dealt with the emotional impact of his revelation. A storm that is less noisy, one that has to do with Camilla, William, as well as the crown's long-term form. Because Camilla had been acting in a different way than Anne, who had been directly facing Charles, she wasn't absent while she was silent. It was a plan. For months, she had been aware of his deteriorating condition. She had seen the restless evenings, heard the personal anxieties, noticed the minor physical alterations that others wrote off as weariness. She too came to her own conclusion. The structure would stay more stable the less people knew. That was loyalty to some. It felt like captivity to Anne. A complex, nuanced, and purposeful power dynamic had emerged behind the palace curtains. Within the royal walls, information equals power. Camilla had been carefully controlling that influence. Charles's access became more restricted. Discussions were diverted. Under the pretense of maintaining focus and continuity, potential exposures were gently discouraged. She presented herself as more than just a wife, but as the gatekeeper. And in doing so, she acquired an unparalleled advantage: authority over the story of the crown's vulnerability. Whether Charles was struggling was no longer the question. It was who would write that battle's narrative. And could harmony endure the quiet conflict taking on inside the palace? Advisors were only given some information. Employees were subtly redirected. Additionally, anyone who pushed too hard for clarification had their inquiries eased, redirected, or quietly silenced. By limiting who was aware of what and when, Camilla established herself as the custodian of the king's world. In public, she seemed stable, devoted, and protective. In private, she carefully controlled the information flow, much like a strategist defending the core of a shaky empire. The understanding struck a deep chord with Anne. She had spent decades standing next to Charles, withstood public outcry, absorbed criticism, remained devoted without looking for praise. It seemed more than exclusion to learn that Camilla had been fully aware of the king's sickness, while she purposefully chose to stay unaware of it. It was like being moved. She was hurt by more than just the concealment. The implication was that no one trusted her anymore. She had been discreetly pushed aside from the position she had held for so long, that of the unwavering constant, the stabilizing influence. And someone she thought was driven by consolidation, rather than just family protection, took its place. Have an impact. Place. Narrative command. But Camilla was aware of the danger she was incurring. She was afraid that if people learned too soon about Charles's deteriorating health and personal choices, they would instinctively turn to Anne, the devoted sister, the stoic upholder of tradition, the royal who had never sought publicity but was well respected by the institution. And power in a monarchy is sympathy. The balance within the palace might quickly change if popular opinion supported Anne. Camilla's grip tightened. Her quiet had two purposes: defensive as well as self-preserving. The mood of the palace started to shift, as was to be expected. Not too loudly, but clearly. There were two silent groups: senior courtiers and longtime employees who felt that openness was crucial were Anne's supporters on one side. They were concerned that over-controlling information might damage confidence and spark a more serious catastrophe. Camilla's supporters, who believed that containment was required, were on the opposing side. The monarchy, media, and markets would all be destabilized by such early exposure. No official declaration of the split was ever made. However, it was sensed. In conference spaces, in hallways, in the delicate tension that exists between looks. What started out as a private health battle was turning into something much riskier: a break in the institution. Furthermore, fractures do not stay undetected for very long if they are not cared to. The silence that pervaded the mansion did not last long. Gradually, the tension that had started out as an undercurrent turned into a violent one, full of distrust, doubt, and unset alignment. William was particularly affected. He was navigating a changing terrain under his feet, torn between respect for Anne's growing moral authority, devotion to his father, and awareness of Camilla's strategic dominance. He knew the stakes: Charles's deteriorating health, Camilla's increasing control over facts, Anne's increasing sway over senior courtiers. These threads weren't isolated, they were coming together. Every discussion had political significance. Meaning was conveyed by each delay. The alignment of every public gesture was closely examined. William understood that the monarchy would split in ways not seen in the contemporary age if the division widened even more. Then it took place. One public appearance. It was supposed to be ordinary. Rather, it was the turning point in time. Charles took the stage in front of the country, poised and well-dressed, but he was deceived by something subtle. His hand trembled a little, a glance that lingered just a bit too long. A lingering pause. Anne was standing next to him, and there was a narrative in her face that no words could convey. Images started to circulate in a matter of seconds, replayed, shared, and clipped. The shudder, the far-off emphasis. Anne's eyes were sparkling from the stress of maintaining her poise. The appearance of smooth continuity broke. The palace has precisely planned stability for months. Every look is calculated. To demonstrate endurance, each movement is weighed. This particular moment, however, defied choreography. Charles seemed clearly weaker. There was a noticeable attempt to keep up, both physically and symbolically. Even while the public was still unaware of its full extent, his previously unwavering presence appeared to be burdened by something they could now perceive. Only a few seconds passed. However, the effect was seismic. Anne's response was more powerful than any words of wisdom. Later, witnesses spoke of the obvious gleam in her eyes, which was human rather than contrived or symbolic. Unmanaged. The crack was historic for a woman who was characterized by steely discipline. The emotional toll of months of silence seems to have finally come to the surface in the open. The press reacted immediately. In a matter of hours, broadcast panels and front pages were filled with footage. The video was repeatedly slowed down frame by frame by analysts. The tremor was discussed by commentators, the phrase, the stance. There was a flurry of speculation. Once restricted to the royal hallways, concerns regarding Charles's health have lately become widely discussed. The battle was no longer concealed, and the story could no longer be contained in the palace. Health was no longer the exclusive topic of discussion. It had grown to include the family's emotional state, the crown's stability, and the institution's inherent longevity. The leaks followed. Bits and pieces of private conversations, hints about medical conversations, silent allusions to internal strife and succession preparation. Not all of it is finished. Nothing was formally confirmed, but enough. Enough to spark conjecture in mainstream media. The story solidified from what had been a rumor. The tale was out of the palace's control. Parts of the truth had started to seep through the gaps. Almost immediately, the public's opinion changed. Her image was changed by Anne's emotional expression, which was reenacted on televisions all over the world. She was more than just the unwavering sister. She turned into a representation, to be honest, of allegiance, of emotional fortitude. People came together to support her. Her response was interpreted by many as a reflection of their own discomfort, the feeling that something essential was being omitted. She became the crisis's emotional fulcrum. Camilla's silence, on the other hand, which was initially taken as poise, started to take on a new appearance: determined, distant, perhaps complicit. Perception quickly changed as a result of her failure to publicly confront the escalating tempest. The restraint that had been intentional now seemed evasive, defensive. The strain mounted among the royal household. William was the most acutely affected. Advisors started to watch him for clues. The media publicly conjectured about his future function. Analysts argued about whether the monarchy was about to enter a period of transition or not. Allegiances were cemented behind the scenes. Some shared Anne's belief in openness and moral clarity. There were others who supported Camilla's containment and control strategy. For William, the topic of future succession was no longer speculative. It happened instantly. On a public stage, the facade, which had been meticulously maintained for decades, had crumbled in a matter of seconds. Furthermore, no amount of calculated messaging could change it back to how it was. With the world watching, the monarchy was now in the open. Its internal conflicts are no longer concealed by formalities. The pressure peaked. Calculation gave way to haste in Buckingham Palace. They called an emergency council, senior members of the royal family, trusted advisors, brokers of institutional power. Everyone was called. Charles's condition, his secret judgments, the consequences for succession, the crown's long-term stability. It was all laid out on the table. It was the most intense the palace has seen in decades. Still bearing the emotional burden of her brother's confession, Anne entered the room with the knowledge that this meeting would be more than a crisis management session. It would determine the future of the monarchy. Anne came to the emergency council as an opponent rather than a silent bystander. Camilla sat across the table, calm and determined, standing up for the plan she had painstakingly developed over several months. William stood between them, pulled simultaneously in three directions: devotion to his dad, obligation to the crown, and the depressing knowledge that the future may be coming sooner than anyone had anticipated. There was a lot of anxiety in the air at Buckingham Palace. Long-standing power elites, constitutional advisors, and senior royals convened around one inevitable question. When a monarchy's stability is suddenly called into question, how do you handle it? Rumors have been circulating in private for weeks. Now, after Charles's tepid public moment, those rumors had burst into widespread conjecture. The institution's response was no longer the question. It was the manner. How fast, too? The agenda was blatant. How much of the truth ought to be made public? Is it necessary to initiate backup plans in case of a power outage? And if things got out of hand, how could the organization prevent itself from collapsing? First to speak were the advisors. Emotional reconciliation was not their goal. It had to do with optics, stability over emotion, authority over openness. They cautioned that revealing all of Charles's failing health could cause uncertainty at a crucial time, upsetting markets, upsetting political cycles, and undermining public trust. They contended that the fallout might be contained with a cautious statement, but only if there was complete unanimity. Anne responded immediately. She believed that the crisis stemmed from containment. Secrecy had shattered confidence rather than maintained stability. How long can the palace pretend to be in control when the public has already seen the cracks? She said. Now there was no diplomatic constraint in her voice. It was final. Opposite her, Camilla stayed composed. She defended the plan that had been in place for the past few months. She maintained that information control was a sort of protection rather than manipulation. Preservation of Charles's honor, preserving the continuity of the institution, shielding the crown from public view. Where Camilla saw caution, Anne saw a concentration of power. She accused her outright of ignoring family advice, of using silence to consolidate power, of cutting off even loyal allies from the decision-making process. After months of simmering behind royal etiquette, the conflict now broke out in the open, subject to the harsh examination of an emergency council. The voices become piercing. Advisors moved uncomfortably. William kept quiet, taking in all that was said. Then, suddenly, Charles said something. He spoke more softly than usual, weaker, but clearly intentional. Furthermore, his remarks lacked strategic intent. It was intimate. Charles got up slowly. There was silence in the room. Despite his obvious effort, there was a surprising steadiness in his voice. He didn't use force to defend himself. Tradition was not invoked by him. Rather, he made a plea as a protector of something greater than himself, not as a sovereign. He called for harmony, not for self-preservation. For the crown, however, he acknowledged his poor judgment, to seclusion, to carrying too much weight for too long. He admitted that there were repercussions to concealment, and that those repercussions were now being felt immediately. However, he begged for one thing, so there would be no divide in his legacy. The room softened for a moment. The emotional impact of her brother's vulnerability was felt even by Anne, who was still scarred by exclusion. Though it changed, the rage that had driven her confrontation did not go away. Then William said something. He had been still until then, observing, absorbing, assessing. The atmosphere was sharply broken by his words when he eventually stepped in. He didn't take sides. He agreed with Anne's demand for openness. He understood Camilla's justification for restrained stability. Then, he completely reframed the crisis. This was no longer a personality conflict. The question was whether the monarchy could change with the times or get supplanted by it. There was steel beneath the calmness of his tone. Whatever the council decided inside those walls would have an impact for generations to come, he told them. Credibility was now more important for survival than silence alone. His voice caused the room to align for a fleeting instant, not entirely cohesive, but concentrated. The conference ended with a royal edict that was seismic in its implications, restrained in its words, and surprising in its time. The exact wording was still confidential. The people there comprehended enough. The king was venturing into uncharted terrain. They had drawn lines. The alliances had changed. Additionally, the internal power dynamics had subtly shifted. Anne retreated to a private room later that evening, long after the chamber had been cleared. No cameras, no advisors, not a witness. She decided for herself there, in the silence. Not impulsive, not rash, intentional. She would stand up to pressures within the institution itself in order to preserve her brother's legacy. She didn't cry out of surrender. They were determined. Her faith had been damaged by Charles's secret struggle. However, it had also made her more determined. Anne sat by herself as the palace fell into an uncomfortable silence, taking in the chaos that had consumed the crown, and being aware that whatever order had been made that day was just the start. The letter, the altercation, the admission, Camilla's deliberate quiet, the public fails, the emergency council. Another layer of the monarchy's meticulously preserved exterior has been removed with every passing instant. The series of events inside the palace felt destabilizing and overwhelming to many. It became something else to Anne. Crucible. She had been disciplined, restrained, and faithful to the crown all her life. She had never aimed for fame, never asked for praise. However, she now realized that something had changed. She was no longer just providing assistance, it was crucial. Her mind wandered back to her early years, to a time when identity was subordinated to titles, back when she was only a sister to Charles. She recalled how his shoulders had always carried a greater burden. He had carried expectancy in a different way even as a youngster. The unspoken knowledge that he would one day represent centuries of custom. She had seen him give up his personal liberties to fulfill that destiny. She no longer saw a king crumbling after witnessing him struggle under the tremendous load of the crown. She witnessed her brother in the midst of his most vulnerable moment. That insight changed her. Sorrow turned into determination. She was aware that the storm was far from over. Camilla's plan had only been revealed. It had not disappeared. The palace's divisions continued to simmer beneath courteous banter. Silently, loyalties were split between control and transparency. Future wars were unavoidable. Subtle conflicts about messaging might arise. Beyond access. Excessive influence. Anne was not a fan of showmanship. She was ready to stand her ground, though. Her next action was calculated. She wrote a measured, poised, and cautious public statement. It recognized that without revealing personal information, the monarchy was at a time of introspection. It provided assurance without deceit, sincerity without being careless. The country needed stability. She supplied it. She took on a role that she had always personified but had never publicly claimed with those words. Pillar of the royal family's emotions. She steadied the story in public. In her heart, she knew the greater reality. Winning a power battle was not the goal. It had to do with preservation. She would watch. She would pay attention. She would wait. She would also take action when needed. But not for power, but for legacy. Her constraint had strength. A quiet power undervalued by many. And that silent power may end up being the most important factor in the future of the monarchy's shifting equilibrium.